Last weekend I realised it was almost 1 year since I started this channel, and therefore about that long since I started running regularly. So coming up on this anniversary, I wanted to test my new fitness gains and see where I was at. So last weekend, with about 2 days notice, I decided to run a maximum effort 10k, something I've never really done before. How fast would I be able to go after only a single year of regular running and with no specific training for this distance or attempt? Well, it turns out much faster than I thought. I managed 10k in 39 minutes and 54 seconds to go sub 40 for the first time ever. And to be honest with you, for the first time of trying too. Initially I was a little surprised it came as easy as it did, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Because I committed to a few simple principles with my running over this last year that made forward progress in a 10k PB inevitable. And this is how. So although I've not been training specifically for a 10k, I've obviously done some running over this last year, whilst balancing that with weightlifting and various other hobbies of mine. And I want to go through both what my running training has looked like since starting this channel, and also what preparation I did in the day, which made this 10k PB far more likely to happen. So first things first, I'm still relatively new to running, and I don't follow a specific training program or have any coaching expertise. Like most runners, I'm self-taught. Learning to do it when I was about 2 years old, and from then until about 26, I didn't give running a whole lot more thought. So when I started to make running a habit in 2023, I was a real novice, and truly I didn't know what I was doing. But as a former mediocre powerlifter, I did have some appreciation of how to get stronger, and it turns out to be a remarkably similar process to how you run faster. To get stronger, you need to increase your training volume gradually over time, so lift heavier weights or do more reps and sets of the same weight more frequently. And as a runner, the exact same principle applies, except running volume is a product of your running distance multiplied by the relative intensity that you cover it at. But as a beginner runner, this concept had passed me by and I was only focusing on one part of the equation: intensity. I would try to run a 5k faster and faster each week and thought this was the key to being a better runner. And training this way, I could do a park run in about 24 minutes and finish well in the front half of the field, which made me think I was above average and training right. But this above average result was more a fact of me being a male in his mid-20s who was willing to suffer on a Saturday morning, rather than actually having a well-conditioned cardiovascular system. Fitness is all relative, and I was taking for granted my higher starting point than a lot of other people at parkrun and confusing that for success. But after a few months training like this, I'd exhausted my newbie gains, my times were plateauing, and I was burned out. I soon realised what I really lacked was a good aerobic base, and I probably needed to change my amateur approach to training if I wanted to make progress. I only started making real strides forward, if you'll pardon the pun, when I decided to focus on the other part of the volume equation: running longer distances, and doing them at a lower intensity too. And this is the main change that I can point to which helped me explode my running fitness and run a sub 40 minute 10k. I started exclusively training with slow, easy paced runs and introduced a long run every 1 to 2 weeks. This focus on running longer distances at lower intensities required a mindset shift, and for me also to swallow my ego. But this is really the foundation of any good running program. Spending increasing amounts of time month after month in heart rate zones 2 and 3 helped me to build my aerobic base, allowing me to not only run longer distances, but also to run faster over shorter distances. When I started off running, I was covering around 10 kilometers a week, and now I'm at close to 50 kilometers or 30 miles a week. And even today, anyone that follows me on Strava knows the vast majority of these kilometers are at or slower than my recent marathon pace, so between 5 and 6 minutes per kilometer. There's only actually been a handful of runs I've done in the last 3 months which have even got within 30 seconds per kilometre of the pace required to run a sub 40 10k. And the last time I ran a 4 minute per kilometre pace prior to this 10k was before Christmas. Now don't get me wrong, if you were to design a programme aiming to run a faster 10k, you would definitely be doing more high intensity sessions than I've done. But over these last few months, my focus has been on the marathon I ran in April and now a couple of ultras I've got coming up in the summer. Not this 10k. An average week of training for me at the moment looks like this. I'm doing around 3 medium distance, easy to moderate runs and then 1 longer run which may or may not involve a bunch of hills. In fact, I can't remember ever doing a max effort 10k before, and my previous PB according to Strava was 43 minutes and 24 seconds, which was only a couple of months ago and part of a rare interval session. Most running programs will recommend that about 80% of your mileage should be of easy or moderate intensity, and around 20% a bit harder, doing intervals, tempo runs or hills. These help to build your VO2 max and your lactate threshold, which will improve your top speed endurance. So I could have probably gone sub 40 running fewer kilometres than I do now if a consistent proportion of those kilometres had been with harder sessions. Obviously not everyone will be able to simply run the distance I'm doing at the low intensity I'm doing it at and go sub 40. But again, I want to stress I'm a 27-year-old man without any major injury or disability. So theoretically I'm in the best demographic for pure athletic performance. But my point is that despite my suboptimal preparation, Just by increasing my weekly mileage and building that aerobic base, I've got fit enough to smash my 10k PB and run a decent time all within a single year. In the future, I'm sure I'll knuckle down and train properly for the 10k distance with a greater focus on more intense runs. And I'm sure I'll be able to further improve my lactate threshold or VO2 max or any technical running buzzword of your choice. But if you're a novice like I was and are serious about wanting to improve your 10k time, by far and away the largest proportion of your training should be slower and easier than your target race pace. Now, having taught you to suck eggs by saying that running more makes you fitter, it's important I qualify this advice with my next principle, which has been critical to me going sub 40 in the 10k. To run further and get fitter, you need to stay healthy. When I was starting out, I was plagued with injuries. I suffered with Achilles tendonitis, runner's knee, and also got a stress fracture in my right foot following a solo ultramarathon attempt that we don't like to talk about on this channel. This isn't fun. And all these injuries had the same effect on me. They stopped me from training and they shattered my confidence and motivation to keep running. But they also all had one more thing in common. They were probably preventable. Most non-traumatic running injuries have the same root cause, and that's overtraining. Your heart and muscles are far quicker to adapt to increased training volumes than the rest of your body, especially your soft tissues like tendons and ligaments. So although you may be getting aerobically fitter and capable of running further distances, these soft tissues often aren't given enough time to adapt to this increased training stimulus. When I started running, I was a largely sedentary powerlifter who was used to performing a handful of reps of heavy barbell movements, but certainly wasn't accustomed to the repetitive strains that come from taking thousands of steps, one after the other with a running gait. So I was noticing niggles and aches despite only initially running around 10k each week. And when I ignored these niggles and kept pushing, I was left injured and having weeks off training where I was losing fitness and just getting frustrated. So after a bit of trial and error, I've now got a few different strategies I employ to prevent these overuse injuries. I limit increases in my weekly running volume to around 10%. That includes running mileage and intensity. And every month or so I'll take a week where I reduce this volume by about a third as a deload week. This allows my soft tissues to catch up with what I'm asking of them. I split my hardest training sessions, be it running or lifting, at least 48 hours apart, so I can recover in between, and I recognise that there's a compromise when it comes to my total training volumes if I want to run and lift simultaneously. Once or twice a week I do a series of prehab exercises, focusing on strengthening the muscles and soft tissues around my hips, knees and ankles. These include toe raises, wall sits, glute bridges, eccentric calf raises, and a few other movements. I typically do 3 sets of each to failure, and it takes me around 20 minutes. Before my runs, I tend to do a bit of foam rolling on my legs, followed by a gentle warm-up of some dynamic stretching and an easy first mile or two. And I make sure I'm always wearing a good pair of running shoes. It makes all the difference, and replacing these shoes once they've expired their lifespan is important too. For my daily trainers, I've just upgraded from these Clifton 8s that were way past their best, having ran close to 1,000 kilometers in them, to these Clifton 9s. These aren't super shoes or the most advanced daily trainers on the market, but they're a good quality supportive shoe for my neutral foot, which helps keep my running form in check and my bank account out of its overdraft. Also in general, the brighter and more offensive the colour of the shoe, the better it is, for injury prevention and stuff. Listen, there's nothing groundbreaking here. These are just simple fundamentals, but following these tips, I've been able to stay healthy these last few months and continue to make consistent progress. Right, if you're going to try and run a PB in the 10k, whatever your target time, you need to be intentional about your effort. Failing to plan is planning to fail and all that. Now that might sound a bit rich coming from someone who didn't train intentionally for the 10k and had just ran 10 miles the previous day, but on that morning I knew I was aiming for under 40 minutes, so I made every effort to prepare for it. I started off by foam rolling that morning to loosen up my muscles. I didn't obsess over my exact nutrition because, as I said, if all went to plan, I'd only be running for 40 minutes. I just had a banana and a glass of water about half an hour before heading out the door. As a running novice, I used to turn up to parkruns and just go. And the first few Ks would feel horrific as I hadn't warmed up. So on the day I did a gentle warm-up jog for about 10 minutes, followed by a few dynamic stretches. And then before I started, I also did a few sets of strides where I ran for about 20 seconds at increasingly faster paces. Not only is a warm-up reducing your chance of injury, but in the setting of trying to get a PB, it's also getting your body and muscles ready for the top-end speed you're trying to reach from the get-go. And by far and away the best thing I did on the day was to know my target pace and wear a GPS watch. Although I didn't know whether or not I would be able to go sub 40 on the day, I knew that was what I was aiming for. So I'd need to be averaging just under 4 minutes per kilometre or around 6 minutes 26 per mile. And as someone who wasn't used to doing interval runs and speed work, I thought that would be most likely achieved by maintaining a consistent pace throughout, rather than aiming for negative splits. Running a genuine PB is really hard no matter your fitness because you're going to be working close to 100% intensity and every part of your body will be screaming. I knew if I'd given myself half a chance, I would have definitely eased off throughout the run and convinced myself I was running faster than I actually was. That's because maintaining 4 minutes per kilometre pace throughout the 10Ks is increasingly hard the longer you run, as the lactate in your tissues builds up. You can see this with my heart rate graph from the run. If I just tried to go off pure vibes and maintain a constant subjective intensity throughout, then to run at 95% intensity on my last kilometre would be much slower than 95% for my first kilometre, if you see what I mean. So by wearing my running watch, I was constantly reminded of my average pace and my kilometre splits, and so could make the tiny necessary adjustments to keep roughly to this pace throughout. And from my very limited race experience so far, of 1 marathon and about a dozen park runs, I know it is much easier in a race setting to maintain a personal best pace. That's because unless you're leading the race, you've got other people around you that you can use to help pace yourself. It's much easier to try and hang onto the tails of someone running at your target speed than to generate that pace off your own volition. So if you want to further increase your chances of a PB, it's probably best to enter a race with a fast course, i.e. something flat. I wasn't in a race setting unfortunately, but I was lucky enough to have my wife Lil, who spent most of the run cycling with me at around the pace I needed to go, and who promised me pancakes when we got home if I hit sub 40, so kind of the same thing. I also chose the flattest route, which was sturdy underfoot. For me, this was my local canal, so I did a 5k out and back route. Not entirely ideal as it involved me having to slow to a stop and turning around to re-accelerate at the 5k point, but good enough and relatively low traffic. I also wore a faster pair of running shoes, the Brooks Hyperion Max. These aren't super shoes with a carbon plate, which I would have loved to have worn frankly, but can't afford. They're just a much more lightweight shoe with a stiffer cushioning midsole, which may or may not give me better energy return with each step, especially at faster race paces. It's hard to say how much of a difference these shoes make, but people that know a lot more about running than I do seem to think they help, so take from that what you will. Running is a simple discipline in many ways and doesn't rely as heavily on technique as lots of other sports. Of course there's some nuance in managing training volumes and how you structure your hill repeats or fartleks or whatever, but for the most part, the more effort you put into your training, the better the outcomes with your running, especially for non-elite runners. Therefore, your biggest barrier to making progress and smashing that 10k PB, whatever the target time, is lack of consistency, whatever the reason, or speaking from experience, whatever the excuse. Aside from injury, my biggest barrier to staying consistent with my running over this last year has been my own motivation. Either I've had a crazy week at work, a lot going on at home, or I've not been enjoying myself. So more recently, I've been laser focused on just keeping my running simple and trying to enjoy my training. The reason I don't do a bunch of high intensity sessions is because I don't enjoy them as much as longer, slower, often more off-road runs. Hence why I'm training for an ultra. I don't know what a good time to run 100 kilometers is. I'm just enjoying the process of training to run that distance. So by all means, you push for that PB, whether it's a sub 40 10k or a sub 1 hour 10k or whatever the target is. The important thing is that you keep your training enjoyable so that you keep running in the long term. And if you can keep doing that, I'm sure progress will come.
Well done.